Hey, second and third graders. Okay, so right here I have a copy of the Robert E. Lee history reading. What I'm gonna do for this week is I'm actually gonna read it out loud in this video. You can just listen along. But what I would like you to do is maybe have a highlighter or a pen or pencil and just underline stuff you think might be important for later, because there are several questions in your reading. I think there's 1, 2, and 3 different spots with questions, okay? All right, here we go. Robert E. Lee. To be like George Washington. Have you ever wished you could be like a great person? More than any other person in the world, young Robert E. Lee admired George Washington. Robert E. Lee was born in 1807. He never saw our country's first president, George Washington, had died in 1799. But all the adults remember him. To anyone who would listen, they would tell the great stories of the brave man who led our country to freedom. Young Robert E. Lee was always willing to listen. Tell me more, he would say to his father, who fought as a commander under General Washington. Robert's eyes would shine with pride when he heard that his father was a good friend of George Washington's. It was Robert's father who wrote the famous saying that everyone remembers the most about Washington: first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. Yes, Robert longed to be like the person his father admired so much. His mother did her best to teach him to become like George Washington. You must always do what is right, no matter what. Be honest, be truthful, be gentle but strong. Spend your money wisely. The older that Robert E. Lee became, the more he appreciated his mother's wise advice. Robert E. Lee enters West Point. Robert grew to be a handsome, bright young man. He was sure he wanted to be a soldier, so he entered West Point, a military academy that trained soldiers to become leaders. There were 87 boys in Robert's class. Each day they worked and studied together. It was not long before the students admired Robert. His duties always came first, they would say. Someday he'll be a great leader. West Point was a strict school with many rules, but his rules did not bother Robert. He knew there were rules to help him become a good army officer. To him, rules were made to be obeyed. When it was time to graduate, only half his class was left. The others had quit. Robert graduated with the second highest grades in his class. All right, then it has a question. Then it has a piece with questions. They're just true or false. You'll answer. All right, now after graduation. After graduating, Robert E. Lee married Mary Curtis. She was the great-granddaughter of Martha Washington. Arlington, Virginia became their home. Across the river from Arlington is Washington, D.C. Not very far away is Mount Vernon, the home of George Washington. Robert E. Lee was able to have some of George Washington's furniture in his home. How proud of that he was. Mr. and Mrs. Lee were not always at Arlington. He was an engineer for the United States Army. He had to travel to other states to help plan and build bridges and forts. In 1847, Lee proved himself to be an excellent soldier in war between the United States and Mexico. The North and the South argue. Time passed. The northern and the southern states had been arguing for a long time. Part of the argument was over slavery in the South. Although Robert E. Lee was a Southerner, he thought it was wrong to own slaves. But the biggest part of the argument was over the rights of that each Southern state thought it should have. The Southern states withdrew from the United States when they thought the government was taking away their rights. The Southerners called themselves Confederates. They made their own flag and chose Jefferson Davis to be their president. President Abraham Lincoln wanted to keep the United States together. To do this, there would be a civil war. Each man would have to decide for himself if he believed as the South or as the North. A hard decision. This was a hard decision for Lee. He loved the United States. He loved his home state of Virginia. It made him very sad when Virginia decided to join the Confederate States. He loved the United States, but he loved Virginia more. How can I fight against my own family and the men from Virginia, he asked himself. The South had few factories to make guns and fewer men to fight than the North. Though he knew even that the South had little chance of winning, he sadly gave up his position in the United States Army. He must do his duty. He did what he felt was right. He came back to Virginia, where the Confederate Army was being raised to fight the North. Robert E. Lee was chosen to be a commander of the Southern armies. This did not make him happy, for he knew how horrible war is. Before the Civil War was over, thousands of men would die. All right, and then another comprehension check. It just has some questions you need to answer. Make sure and answer those questions in complete sentences, okay? All right, and then let's see. The Civil War is the next section. The Confederate soldiers loved General Lee. Although he always expected them to do their duty, he always was kind and understanding. The soldiers would cheer General Lee when he rode on his beautiful gray horse, whose name was Traveler. When their general was in danger during battle, the soldiers would refuse to fight until General Lee rode back to safety. For 4 years, General Lee and his soldiers fought a brave fight. Although General Lee was very wise, the Union Army was much bigger and stronger. Lee had to give up. The North won the war. The Civil War is over. At the close of the war, many soldiers were bitter, for a few even wanted to leave the United States and go to Europe to live. General Lee talked to his men. "We are one country again. Go back to your homes. Help build up our country again." Now that the war was over, what would General Lee do? He had told his soldiers to help build up their country. He must do it too. General Lee was offered many jobs. When he was asked to become president of Washington College in Virginia, he said yes. Washington College was named after George Washington. As he had taught his soldiers, he would teach his students to do their duty and love their country. In 1870, only a few years after the Civil War, Lee died. Washington College was given a new name, Washington and Lee University. The North won the Civil War. The South lost, but the North and the South agreed that, like General George Washington, General Lee was one of the greatest American generals who had ever lived. All right, and then on the back it has some more questions. All right, so I hope as you were listening to this video you highlighted or underlined some important stuff that should help you answer some of the questions. But you guys got this. You can answer those questions.